I want to say a few words about JD Vance's speech he gave in Munich, and also comment on Lanz and Precht. Their podcast was published before Vance's speech, but they're both connected. I think as far as JD Vance's speech in Munich is concerned, I think it's a pivotal speech. I would say everybody agrees here, the people who like it and also the people who don't like it. And I think pivotal in many ways. I think I put on X that this is one of those John F. Kennedy, I'm a Berliner moments. It's going to go in history or the Iron Curtain by Winston Churchill. It's one of those speeches. And here's why. I think what JD Vance is pointing out is the eternal drift between the value system of the United States and Europe. The Europeans, as much as they like to believe it, have never had a culture of freedom the way the Americans had. And by the way, that's actually logical if you think about it. I mean, the Europeans fled Europe to the United States in the pursuit of freedom because they were suppressed by totalitarian states or states that were nearly totalitarian. And it was the United States which brought freedom to Europe in 1945. And for quite a bit, maybe 2 or 3 generations, that held on. But now that the generations are dying out that were enjoying that freedom, which was imposed to some extent by the Americans onto Europe after World War II, that freedom is vanishing again. Europe has a tendency for totalitarianism. That means that there are certainly roots of democracy in Europe. I mean, for God's sakes, they invented it. But the same way that the birthplace of democracy, Greece, today doesn't resemble a democracy at all. It's full of crony capitalism, corruption. The rule of law is somewhat given, but really not the way it should be according to their own theories that they came up with over 2,000 years ago. The same way we also have the core of Europe, Central Europe, or the core of the today's EU, resembling certainly a lot of ideas from democracy, from the Enlightenment, from Voltaire and from Leibniz and Montesquieu and all these people that wrote the blueprint for what we call democracy, modern democracy today. However, it's still not the same. And the fundamental difference is that in America, it starts from the individual. Everything starts from the individual. It's a bottom-up society. As much as we try to undo that, as much as particularly wokeism and COVIDism with all this top-down imposition onto our freedoms, as much as that has been undermined, nevertheless, America always comes back to the individual first, and then we build up a society based on that, with rules, with the rule of law, with the separation of powers, with checks and balances. We have all these things, but it always starts with the individual, and I think that's very different than the European understanding of governance, where an elite governs and the rest has to subdue themselves to the elite. Now, the elite can change. There are elections, and it's left and it's right and this and that. All of these things are given. So it's not like a static dictatorship by any means. However, if the elite decides, then you have to follow. Otherwise, you're an enemy of the state. And that's a very, very different understanding of democracy. And I'm not even saying it's right or wrong, but that's how the Europeans see it, and that's why they are so upset at JD Vance. And I think JD Vance's speech is important in that sense that it has been pointed out for once and for all that, look, we Americans have imposed our understanding of freedom and democracy onto Europe after World War II, and we funded it. But now we have to stop doing it because we can't afford it anymore. And also, it's not okay to be funding and promoting something for almost a century. At some point, you guys have to take over and do it on your own way. The same way the Americans can't import their values of democracy and freedom into Afghanistan or Iraq, they can't do it with Europe either, or Japan for that matter. So it's at some point, you, the Europeans in this case, have to take over the torch and build your own version of the democracy that you want. And the democracy that Europe wants has always been wanting. Ever since the Roman Empire collapsed and the Europe was built upon the tribes that eventually coalesced into Christianity and created this, amazing continent of Europe that came up with all these beautiful things and art and the Enlightenment and technology and all that stuff. That has always been built on the concept of an elite of knowing people, sort of a Platonian democracy, if you will. That's what Europe really stands for. That's the deep culture of Europe, that the people who know, the people who are in the know, that they have the right to decide. And that's why there is this misunderstanding or deep mistrust now between America and Europe. Because we here in America, we start from the bottom up. We are deeply individually driven. So we don't accept the notion that some elitist, know-it-all expert class tells us what to do. That's why we refused Fauci. Fauci had to be pardoned by Biden. Otherwise, he would go to jail because what he did was not acceptable. And not acceptable by our terms of understanding of freedom. You can't infringe on my freedom based on an idea. And by the way, I'm not even talking about the fact that, it's highly likely that he created the coronavirus and all of that stuff, or at least financed and helped create it. Maybe not intentionally, but still, all of these things, that's not even the point. The point is just that you can't infringe on people's liberties just in the name of science, or even worse, in the name of your own ideology. We had 4 terrible years of wokeism under Biden. Fortunately, we're done with this. There is a cultural revolution happening right now in the United States, which is very refreshing, and hopefully will bring an end to this nonsense here in the United States. Now, in Europe, that's different, because the Europeans are deeply, deeply entrenched in this elitist thinking. And I think, therefore, Vance's speech is a demarcation line between we are here, you are there, you go on your own. And now this brings me to Lanz and Precht and their podcast, which, again, I think is a very valuable contribution to the political discourse in Europe. And what they say is, they're not very happy with Trump and Vance and things like that, of course, but they say a few important things that I agree with. One is that this new politics that JD Vance is promoting, and again, just to keep the facts right, the podcast that I'm alluding to has been published before JD Vance's speech, so the connection is not 100% right, but I still think that they anticipated something like that in their podcast, so therefore it fits. So what they say is, look, that this new policy of America is basically dropping their vassal Europe means that Europe has to emancipate themselves. And I think that's a good thing, because I think Europe as a continent has all the ingredients to build a lasting society that can sustain itself. So unlike maybe Iraq and Afghanistan, which need to do a lot more country building before we can actually talk about some sort of value-based liberty system or something like that, the Europeans have that. And it can be built on an elitist Platonian democracy. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. What's important, though, for Europe, and this is where I disagree with Lanz and Precht, is that there is no such thing as Europe. Europe is not a political cohesive pact. Europe is a geographic concept. And the political entities, like Henry Kissinger says, every political entity requires its own constituency. So if you don't have your own constituency, you don't have a political entity. And the political entity in Europe is the regions, and maybe the countries, maybe the nation states. But maybe Europe has to do some soul searching, some finding. It's certainly not the EU. The EU is a misguided concept with some good ideas, free borders, free flow of capital, those are good things. But having a central bureaucracy in Brussels, and even worse, having a central currency, that's not a good idea. I think it would be too much for this episode now to go into the economics of why the EU is not working. But just to say that the high youth unemployment should be signal enough. When you have high youth unemployment, that means you're mortgaging your future. That means you're throwing away your youth for some sort of well-being today. You're living on borrowed time. And that's what EU is, and that's why it's not a good situation. I think the solution for Europe is to give up on this concept of Europe as a political entity and go back to the nation state, to the constituencies, which are clearly given by what we call the right-wing parties today. And by the way, we shouldn't call them right-wing parties. We should embrace them, take their ideas, get rid of the bad stuff, the Nazi stuff, which, some of it is there, whether it's in Marine Le Pen's party, or whether it's in Alice Weigel's party, or whether it's in Meloni's party. There's certainly some bad elements there, and they can be, the same way that Trump has some bad elements in his following, and that's okay. But there's also a lot of good things, and we should embrace those and move those movements more to the center and build another big center. The big center in the United States as well as in Europe is only possible if you can build it on a strong middle class. You can't build it on the rich elites, and you certainly can't build it on the poor. That's what the woke movement was trying to do, elites and poor. That doesn't work. It has to be built on the middle class. That's the majority of people, number-wise, but also economic-wise. And that's how the economy works. That's how societies work. It's always the middle class. So that's what you need to build it on. Your constituency is the middle class. And you have to have an incentive, an economy that drives this middle class, that builds this middle class. The United States in the 1950s, by the way, Europe in the 1950s, onwards, maybe until Clinton. So between 1950 and 2000, we had a strong middle class in what we call the Western world, which is being eroded now by the elites and by the poor. And I think we need to fix that. We can build an economy which sucks the poor out of the poor into the middle class and keeps the elites and the rich in check. That's my opinion. But again, I started the podcast as comments on Lanz and Precht and also on JD Vance. I think, to summarize JD Vance's speech, in my opinion, pivotal speech, because it draws the demarcation line between the kind of freedom that we understand here in the United States and the kind of freedom that's being lived in Europe, and that's fine. It's good to say things that are different, and hopefully that can be a lesson to Europe and also a motivation for Europe to start building their own continent based on their constituencies, which in my opinion is the nation states, and build on their strengths, and then create a Europe that can withstand attacks from Russia or elsewhere. Just maybe as a side note, I want to say one more thing, which is worth a whole other podcast series. But I think one of the problems that Europe faces is that Europe doesn't have a standing army, a real standing army. And the problem with that is that in order to have a standing army, you need men willing to die in a war. And that hasn't been the case for generations in Europe. It's been the case in the US, it's been the case in Russia. The Europeans don't have that, and that's why they feel so naked. They have the money. The EU is already spending more on defense than Russia, but they don't have the men willing to die in a war, and also not the families willing to send their sons to go and die in a war. Now, there are solutions to that. I think AI and robotics and drones and high tech can help. So we don't actually need to kill that many people anymore in wars. Look at Israel. They're able to fight against bigger numbers with technology. So there's that. But I think in general, I think a rebirth of the nation state in Europe also is necessary, so people are willing to go and fight for something. Nobody's going to fight for an EU today. That's ludicrous. And that will be my critique to Lanz and Precht. Are you going to go fight for the bureaucracy in Brussels to survive? Nobody's going to do that. But people would fight for Bavaria. They'd fight for Germany. People would fight for La Lombardia. They would fight for Italy, maybe. Like, I don't know where that sweet spot is where you find, the constituency. What is the constituency? Where do we stand? The beauty of America is that most Americans actually identify with the American values, whether they live in California, whether they live in Miami, whether they live in New York. Yes, there are differences, and yes, Californians and Texans couldn't be different right now on certain ways. But I think deep down in the roots, we're all the same. We all want, liberty, and that's what America stands for. And Europe is not like that, but the Europe's different. And by the way, that's the beauty of Europe. It's different in many ways, and that diversity can help Europe also. But we need to get back to the person, the sword, and align the person, the sword, with the people who make the decisions, who has the right to tax and who has the obligation and the right for violence and to protect people. In other words, who can raise taxes and who can build standing armies. And once that is done, I think Europe's been doing it for thousands of years. So why shouldn't they be able to do it again? So emancipate yourself, get out from under the wings of the United States, build your own conglomerate of nations, find a way, but start with the constituency. Don't start with the top, with the elite. People don't want that. And then build a strong standing army based on these armies that are built from the bottom up, tax from the bottom up, and everything else will fall into place. Thank you.